summer-like fall day. It's great to see Ream full despite the fabulous weather outside, so it's a tribute to you for all being here. I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center sponsors an array of campus lectures, discussions, conferences, and conversations that foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation, as well as initiatives to foster Jewish-Christian understanding and to enhance our understanding of Catholicism from a global perspective. Today, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to collaborate once again with my colleague, Professor Benny Liu, to welcome a distinguished speaker to campus. Our guest, Professor Kat Jonathan Tran, was supposed to be with us last year, but we had to reschedule, a fact worth noting probably most of all if we consider how much different a place we're in as a country around conversations like this than we were a year ago. It's quite stunning. Today's conversation, Jonathan Tran suggests, is an opportunity to think past the vexed state of conversation about race to ask, what if Christian theology, that is, speech about God, can give us a way forward, ways of talking about race that grant us leverage against racism while gathering a politics that centers the university life around truth, goodness, and beauty. Professor Jonathan Tran is a theologian at Duke University, and he'll help us think in particular ways about ways that race and Christianity are intertwined and ways that he thinks Christianity can be of help in the conversations we have about race. He's Professor of Theological Ethics at Duke University Divinity School, where he serves on the faculty of Asian American and Diasporic Studies. Until recently, he held the George W. Baines Chair of Religion at Baylor University and served as Associate Dean for the faculty. He served as co-editor of the Reflections on and Theory in the Study of Religion series for the American Academy of Religion and Oxford University Press, and is author of The Vietnam War and Theologies of Memory, Foucault and Theology, and Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism. Here we go, right here. We'll get him to sign a copy for us. He's currently writing a book for Cambridge University Press called Race and Christianity, and he's also here with his wife, Carrie, who we're happy to welcome. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan Tran. Oh my gosh, there are so many people in the back, maybe some up on the side if you want to come, or even sit on the floor if you feel more comfortable that way.
Yeah, please come forward. We're gonna, I'll talk for a little bit, but I'm hoping we'll have a bit of a conversation, and I'm really grateful for the students to be in the room, really interested in hearing what students are thinking in this political moment. So, well, first of all, thank you for having me. Being at Holy Cross is a real privilege. I haven't been to your beautiful campus before. I haven't been to this part of the country, and so far it's been a remarkably warm welcome. It's also been remarkably warm. We wanted to come see the leaves, of course, and we were previously in Connecticut, and they said, well, if you go further north, the leaves will be changing. So we came up here, and the people here told me, if you go a little further north, when you get to Maine, there'll be some leaves, and I'm thinking when I get to Maine, they'll say if you go up to the North Pole, maybe some of the leaves will be changing there. So I speak at a lot of colleges and universities. I rarely speak in front of my wife, who's here. So I'm also a huge basketballer. I spend a lot of time on the basketball court. And every time I play basketball and Carrie comes with me, she always says afterwards, what do you do all that time? Because you're not very good at basketball. So maybe she'll feel about the same way about this here. So thank you for the center for hosting me. Thank you for Professor Liu for being responsible for bringing me to Holy Cross. And again, the goal today is to have a conversation. If you're like me, and you think our democracy is something special and to be preserved, but you think we are in real danger at a kind of inflection point in the future of this country, if not already at its end, then the best thing that we can do as citizens, democratic citizens of a democracy, people who claim each other in a common life, the best thing that we can do is talk. Democracy begins and ends with people assembling and talking, including people of quite profound difference, that oftentimes in the only alternative oftentimes to killing one another or silencing or forcibly educating each other is the basic practice of democratic discourse. My thought is that a place like Holy Cross is especially well suited for this because Christianity, whether it be Protestant or Catholic, provides the minimal conditions, the basic virtues necessary for democratic life, but it also asks for and demands so much more. So the combination of being part of a democratic society, but being a university that is adjacent to the church, and what I'll describe later as a kind of Eucharistic democratic life, I think is ground zero for thinking our way out of the present. I do want to acknowledge that I imagine in this room there are many different takes on the topics that I'll cover today, which are the very topics people say you shouldn't talk about in public. That is religion, race, and politics. And we'll be focusing on all three. So I want to start by acknowledging the broad variety and often contested nature of that variety in our republic right now. And I want us to imagine this as a microcosm of the America we want, regardless of where you stand in it. I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to talk about two types of banned speech, both relate to race. The first kind of banned speech is what we're seeing right now, which is where speech about race is banned, that you can't talk about race. The second kind of banned speech, I'm going to talk about a kind of discourse that took place mostly across American colleges and universities that was regnant maybe just 2 years ago. And this was a culture where you could not talk about race. And so the two types of banned speech around race is one where you can't talk about race, and the second where you can't not talk about race. And to give you a sense of the kind of seismic shift since just this time last year is the difference between these two types of bans. One where you cannot talk about race, if in talking about race in public in a university campus genuinely presents a threat to your career, if not else otherwise. We can't forget that Charlie Kirk was not only murdered and assassinated, he was murdered and assassinated on a university campus. So one is where you can't talk about race, and the other one is where you can't not talk about race. So I'll talk about both of those. I'll visit with a British sociologist named Stuart Hall, who I think will give us some resources for thinking about the question, which I think these two bans raises for us, which is this question. As a society, how much do we want race to be an organizing principle of our common life? Right? If both of these are bans around speech related to race, how much do we as people in America want to continue to talk about race? Stuart Hall has incredibly powerful and largely unheeded words of wisdom for us on this. And the third thing I would do is turn from banned speech about race to what banning speech in an American democracy means at all. And here I'll step back into the larger political moment, and then I'll conclude with some things that theology has to offer, Christian theology has to offer. My hope is to speak for maybe 30, 35 minutes, and then to open it up to the work of talking together. So please be thinking of comments or questions that you have for me or one another. On Friday, the New York Times ran an article about what's happening at my institution, Duke University. Duke University is a number 6th, 7th, 8th, depending on who you ask, ranked national university. Before coming to Duke, I would have been told and would have told myself there's no better place to go and do what I do, that is American Christian theology, than to go to an elite university like Duke. Since I've gotten there, I signed my contract May or something like that. Since I got there, Duke University has had voluntary separations, where the voluntary is, of course, in quotes, with 600 employees. The university is $600 million in the red and counting. The Department of Education, the Department of Justice, currently has suits across the against the university, planning to fine the university by way of yanking federal funds to the tune of another $120 million. There are active investigations against the law school, all across the university campuses, offices that used to go by the name diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, ethnic studies programs, critical theory programs are being shuttered. And not shuttered in a slow, careful way, rather overnight shuttered. Like you went to the medical school on Friday and there was an office for diversity. And on Monday, the facade of the building is still there, but it's empty, and from the window has been scraped the name. What's amazing about what's happening to Duke University is not simply what's happening there, but this is happening at a lot of places. You all are approximate to a number of schools where these schools are in rapid freefall. Brown, Columbia, and the question for these universities, right, isn't something like, well, it's been hard, but we've plateaued and we've figured it out. The question is something like, is this the beginning of the end of American higher ed, or at least the beginning of the end of elite institutions? Some of us who are strong believers in the work of American higher ed, which very much includes a Duke or a Holy Cross, are maybe under the perception that a Harvard University is going to stand up for us, fight for us, and defeat the Trump administration. That is the kind of delusion you will give yourself because you've run out of other options. Harvard cannot beat the federal government because the federal government has two kinds of things that, as powerful and as storied of an institution that Harvard is, no one could stand up to. One, they can pull every lever in the federal government's arsenal. Two, they have all the time in the world. We're shortly into the first year of a 4-year run. And so for those people who think that somehow Harvard's going to fight the good fight and defeat the federal government on these questions, those folks need to start thinking bigger about how higher ed will be saved in this moment. One of the things the New York Times article talked about in relationship to Duke, but also generally the Harvards and the Columbias, was what has driven the current administration to go to war effectively with elite institutions, especially those elite institutions that we always thought were beyond the pale, that they existed in a kind of stratosphere that made them untouchable. When I think about, and when I say that there's a banning of race, right, it's quite explicit in some places, right? So think about, for example, the Trump administration's desire to comb through admissions processes, to comb through CVs and publications of faculty members, right? And if you're a person that has written on religion, race, and capitalism, right? There was something that was going around social media the other day where the Trump administration said, we're now going to go after those people who are anti-American, anti-capitalist, and anti-religious. You're in trouble. Because if you're identified as a threat and you're named as a threat to the United States of America, and the United States of America has what I just named, all the levers of the US government and all the time in the world, no one can stand against that stuff. And so when the US government comes calling to a Holy Cross and says something like, we want to go through your admission cycles. We want to determine who's getting access to certain jobs at your university. If they're doing what they did at Duke Law School, which is the current one of the current lawsuits that the Department of Justice, Department of Education has prosecuted against Duke. They want to say, we know you have this thing called Duke Law, the Duke Law Journal. We know in the past that you have stipulated that if you're a person of color, you can write that in your application, and that would give you some points. We're going to shut that down. And then we're going to penalize you for all those years we think that worked against people's benefits or goods. If what you're able to do as a university, as a government, is to look into the institutional practices, including what people teach in their classroom, right? The professor who dared to speak about trans identities in a Texas A&M university. The professor who dares to speak about this, the staff person who raises a flag about that. If all of that, which was previously considered sacred ground, right, under the kind of university academic principles of faculty autonomy, academic freedom, if those things like tenure are no longer protected, if things like university endowments are now taxable by the US government, right, everything is on the table. These are the ways institutions and universities exist. Without them, without these safeguards in place, the university and American higher ed may continue, but it will continue in a way unrecognizable, say, just from a year ago. And that's what we're in the midst of. If you're a student in this room and you know this is going on, good for you. If you're a student in this room and you don't know what's going on, I also want to say, good for you. Because to be caught in the middle of this is to be on a journey that you have no idea how things will end. This is an unprecedented time in American history. If you ask the question, what is driving the current administration to ban race speech? Let me offer three kind of things that they've kind of said, right? The first thing is something the Chief Justice said a number of years ago in relationship to affirmative action. Since then, of course, they've made some decisions on affirmative action that effectively rules out race as a consideration in admissions. And this is in relationship to a law school, in relationship to Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, arguably the most elite private school in America and one of the most elite public schools in America. In that, Justice John Roberts said, Chief Justice Roberts said, the best way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. So one driver in this first ban that wants to kind of erase race considerations altogether is the idea of a kind of post-racial society, echoed in moments like when Reverend Dr. King says, when I think about the future, I imagine a future where my kids will be judged on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. What Justice Roberts is after is something like that. So the first driver in trying to ban race speech is to say, we don't need to think about each other in racial terms anymore. And as soon as we can get rid of thinking of each other, whether institutionally or even interpersonally, the faster that we can do that, the better. So that's the first driver. The second driver is the sense that the consideration of race in things like admissions or hiring cycles is simply, right, runs smack against the idea that we live in a meritocracy. The idea here is that we're all equal players, we're all equal comers, and why not be judged simply on your application? Why should race matter? Right? Shouldn't the main driver in these things, like whether you get a job, whether in the university or Google or the local McDonald's, shouldn't the main consideration be merit? And the thinking here on why you might ban race considerations is to throw race in there, according to this thinking, is tantamount to not hiring someone because they're black. So the thinking of why we ought to ban race speech is something like, well, in the same way that any moral person would say you can't ban a person from getting a job or block a person from getting a job because they're black, the same thinking is you shouldn't advantage a candidate because they're black, right? And so the first one is a worry that if we keep on talking about race, we're going to keep on talking about race. The second one is a concern around that we are a country that's based on a meritocracy. We're a meritocracy. The only thing that should matter is your CV and what's in it. Your race should not matter. The third thing driving the ban, and this would be the most controversial and therefore probably the most contested, is the sense that the administration is in some serious way determined by a kind of racism. Whether it be a racism against seeing a country that, say, 60, 70 years ago was dominated, right, the very face of America was dominated by a white character, and now seeing whether you turn on the television, when you pull up Instagram, when you go to universities, when you go see a movie, that there are way too many people of color. And that adding to what's often been called a replacement theory or a replacement conspiracy or a replacement narrative, that whereas we used to have white people that dominated America, we now have had non-white people, and that hasn't been an accident, that there's been a kind of massive social engineering project that sought to get rid of white people. And so the attempt to kind of ban race speech is in some sense the part of the federal government to turn back the clock on that. Now, whether the driver is something like, the first consideration, the second consideration, or the third one, right, or some combination of the three, all three have led to a set of conditions right now where race speech is effectively banned. That people like me, people like your teachers, my guess, the greatest form of policing that happens actually isn't your professors or your staff at the university. My guess is that the greatest form of policing is yourselves. You no longer know when or where or how to bring up race, or whether you should. So that's the first kind of ban, is that current administration's ban on race considerations and the sense that to do so is in some serious way un-American, especially if the bringing up of race is the dredging up of a history that America would rather soon forget. And whether that history be something like the genocide of Native peoples, the mass chattel enslavement of millions of Americans, whether it be issues related to the southern border or immigration acts that selectively targeted Asian folks, that it feels within the thinking of this first ban un-American to bring that up. And what would be un-American? Why would it be so un-American to rise to the level in your mind of needing to be banned? Well, it's pretty much the idea that America is a city on a hill. It sits above, it stands above, head and shoulders above other nations for its liberties, for its freedoms, for its histories, for the things it's willing to give its lives for, the lives of its citizens. And if America is a uniquely spaced, not only unique among other countries, not only unique among other democracies, but almost unique in the eyes of God, then to dredge up a history of its racism is then to feel effectively un-American. Right? So those would be the reasons for the first kind of ban. That to bring up race in any of those three kinds of ways is, in a sense, to cause a problem. If that's the type of ban on race speech that's currently underway, that we're currently trying to navigate our way through, the previous kind of ban worked almost conversely opposite. It was almost like its mirror opposite, as if the current moment grew up in a direct, contrary, mirror opposite reaction to the first ban. And the first ban happened across American universities probably for about 20 years, maybe a little longer. Its history can be traced all the way back to the 1970s. But this kind of ban didn't feel like a ban, so we didn't know to think about it as a ban. But when we think back on it, we have to understand its ban-like nature. It didn't feel like a ban because it wasn't saying something like, you can't do this. Its ban worked kind of differently. It worked by saying, you do have to do this. And what was the nature of the ban? Well, oftentimes it would go under, and this is why we didn't quite feel like it was a ban, it often came under the auspices of innocuous, even charitable-sounding terms like diversity, equity, and inclusion. And at least for the people who are perpetuating DEI initiatives across the university, whether it be within universities or within administrations or hiring policies at Google or Apple, the idea was something like race really matters. It matters in the history of this country, it matters for each individual, and it matters in this country or for each individual regardless of whether they think it matters. That it so matters that we're going to require people to talk about it even when they don't want to. And what happened over these years was what effectively rose up as a kind of multi-billion dollar industry where people would come into places like Holy Cross, to their faculties, to institutions like Google, federal government, state government, city governments, and people would be asked to talk about race. And there was not much of a choice to do so. If you stood up in that room and said something like, I don't want to talk about race, I'm not racist, and I have no part in American racist history, within that culture, it very quickly became possible that people thought of you as what? A racist, a race denier, a person that was so ensconced in privilege and so positioned beyond these kinds of problems that you're exactly the kind of person that needed to hear that message. And so in this way, it was a kind of converse ban. It wasn't that you can't do these things, which is currently what we're in. It was more like you have to do these things. You had to talk in terms of race, even if you didn't think that was the case. You had to out yourself as a white person. You had to think about yourself as a black person, as an Asian person. And you had to think about these things as if they were constitutive, even essential qualities of who you were. And if you said something like, well, I'm Asian, but I'm not quite sure it really matters that much, well, then you would be educated for exactly how it mattered. I remember when I was a freshman in college, I got to my university, and I had never heard the phrase Asian American. My family never talked about Asian American. We talked about Vietnamese food, pho, and coming to America, and these things, but I had never heard the term Asian American. And I was sat down, I was trying to be in student government, and I think like one of the leaders in the organization sat me down and said, you need to think of yourself as an Asian American. This person, just to let you know, was not Asian. But they had decided how my speech needed to be controlled in a way that they knew better than me what it meant to be Vietnamese. And they were the ones that told me how I should understand my own history, including histories of suffering pretty significant racism. Right? And so, it wasn't a ban that said I couldn't do certain things, but it was a ban insofar as it was a way of saying you can't not do certain things. And if you don't think a ban like that isn't normatively powerful, doesn't come with significant power, try to live in it and try to be a person who says things like, right, I object because I don't think who I am as a person can be reduced to who I am racially. Or in the words of one very prominent scholar who came from the UK and then landed at Yale in the midst of this stuff, a black Brit, he had written a book about the relationship between race and class, and he said the big mistake is to ever think of those things separately. The questions of race and questions of class always go together. He came to Yale, and then he was immediately told that he was a race traitor because he refused to think about racism only on questions of race. Right, and he describes this in an article, doing this for about 10 years and deciding that this was a hopeless situation for him and then returning to the United Kingdom. Right, a situation where you can't not talk about race. And this wasn't just an interpersonal thing, but as I said, as a DEI set of initiatives, it was institutionalized. People were asked, again, voluntold, to go through trainings where they said, you have to talk about race. It's something you don't get to not do. What were the drivers? Were the ones that were on the label? We value diversity. I mean, as a person of color, of course I wanted to believe that if I walked into a room full of white people, that they wouldn't see me as a threat, as a peril, that they would think something was genuinely added, benefited to their community, insofar as I, as a diverse person, had been received there. We wanted to think that our systems, our institutions, our systems, our structures, whether they be around housing, education, healthcare, employment, were genuinely equitable. That, right, the black sanitation company in some city would have equal access to city contracts as anyone else, that they would generally be based, judgments would be based on the merit of their qualifications. So they wanted equity. And if you're a person that comes from another place, right, and you walk into an institution, you want to feel like you're included. So on the face of it, DEI was driven by incredibly benevolent considerations. Diversity, equity, inclusion. You might begin by saying, who would be against that kind of stuff? And yet, once it was institutionalized and increasingly became weaponized in a certain kind of way, then it became very hard to not feel like you're living under a kind of ban. And if you want a sense then of what's happened with the first ban, right, the first ban is, again, imagine as a kind of reaction that comes from the first ban. So the second ban, the one we're currently, right, the one that we're currently going under, you can't talk about race, issues from an initial that you have to talk about race. And that's where we sit in the moment. One part of America wants to return to the previous, where you can't not talk about race. And one part of America is dead set against ever returning to that. And it is very possible that as a country, just on this issue, that we will not be able to move forward. Because, of course, the fissures of this divide between talking about race and not talking about race runs down to some of the most difficult and central histories to who we are as a people. If you feel like the moment around race and banned race speech feels uncomfortable, there's one solace I would give you, and I'll do this before moving on to the next part of the talk. If these things, right, talk about race, don't talk about race, issue in some baseline way to histories of American chattel slavery specifically, which then means that we as a country just can't get over that, the one solace, the one consolation you can take from that is that that's probably a good thing. That American chattel slavery is the kind of thing that a country probably shouldn't be able to get over. That if you could get over it, you had either underestimated its terror or you had just completely misunderstood what it was. So the fact that we are at a kind of crossroads in this country over our long history around race, and specifically chattel slavery and genocide of Native Americans, the fact that we may not be able to go forward as a country may be an indication that our moral life matters, that we continue to have a kind of soul that takes things seriously. So those are modes of banned speeches on both sides. And where do we go from here? So I'm going to talk about one way of thinking about this question that doesn't quite answer it, but then puts it to you all as, right, the next generation that will have to answer this question for America. And then I'll move on to banned speech. The great social theorist, historical sociologist, Stuart Hall was raised in the UK, Caribbean Black Brit, incredible history of scholarship, and has produced a number, as students, a number of very distinguished racial theorists. Stuart Hall wrote a paper where he talked about a number of things about race, but at the end, he kind of poses a question to us. And this is the question that I said at the beginning was largely unheeded, but I hope you, as this next generation of American citizen leaders, will help us as a country think about. And it has to do with these two bands, though he didn't talk about it in those ways. Stuart Hall said race is three things. Race is three modes of socialization. The first socialization is to get people to think they're a race. Why? Well, he said, well, if you look at the history of race, race was concocted as an idea to justify certain kinds of domination and exploitation. It said something like, Tran, you're Asian, and being Asian, you're good at certain kinds of things because who you are as an Asian goes all the way down. And those qualities being all the way down determine what you can do in the world and what you can't do. This was a retroactive ideological justification for modes of whether it be indentured or slave labor that said something like, the reason you're being enslaved or the reason you're being indentured is because you're Asian, and there's something natural about that predicament for you. It's similar to saying, so-and-so is not naturally intelligent, or so-and-so is naturally over-intelligent, so therefore these kinds of jobs should be the case. So the first thing Stuart Hall says is that race is created as an ideology to justify a largely political economic state of affairs. There's nothing natural or essential about race. We just make it seem like it is because it's like the ultimate gaslighting move, right? You look at a group of people, they don't have health care, they don't have housing, they don't have education, and we say something like, well, it's their fault. It's because it's who they are. It's natural to them, right? That's the first move. Race socializes you into thinking that. It socializes the people who suffer it and the people who perpetuate it into thinking that. The second thing he said is that race, after it does that work, which is clearly problematic kinds of socialization, the next thing it does is the people under its forms of domination develop forms of communal life, even though they know it's a lie, right? They know it's a lie set up for a political economic state of affairs. They adopt the story in order to find community and modes of belonging. So you can imagine, say, an Asian migrant group that has been brought here, say, from China for cheap labor in the 19th century after American chattel slavery is ruled illegal. You can imagine those people, they never heard of a concept called Asian. They probably hadn't even heard of a concept called Chinese, but they find each other because they're similarly oppressed. They find modes of community and forms of belonging. And probably they can't avoid it because they're all forced to live in the same community. So that's the second thing. Out of oppression comes forms of community. The third thing is in the same way that community comes out of oppression and community come resistance. So Hall said, it starts as a form of domination race. It produces forms of community that become resistant to the domination. What was Hall trying to say to us? He was saying the downstream effects of race is this. Race and its forms of domination, that is racism, have produced communities of color that find their way, their identity, exactly because of the domination. But he was raising this question to people of color. He said that means every time you resist through your race, every time you organize racially, every time you identify yourself racially, on the one hand, it makes good on the community, it can make good on the resistance, but it will carry forward into the future the domination. And so he was asking us, do you want that? That's the same question we need to be asking today. What do we do with a history and a mode of identification in political organizing and social existence that comes with all three? Because Stuart Hall was saying, you can't have one or two without the other. The domination, the community, and the resistance go together. That's the downstream effect of thinking about race. So if you're going to think about race, you're going to need to come to terms with that reality. He raised this question in 1983, early 1980s. It's still the question for us today. How will we organize ourselves as a society? What kind of role will race play? If the first part of the talk was to talk about the bans on race, either you should talk about race or you can't talk about race, then the next question is something like, even if we could decide, what would we decide? And here I'm really interested in hearing your takes. Whether we should still whether we should still think about ourselves and one another in terms of race. The last part of the talk then is to think about what are theological and Christian resources for helping us think our way out of the present. If the first part of the talk was to talk about modes of banned race speech, the first one being you can't talk about race, the second one being you can't not talk about race, and the second was somewhat Stuart Hall's answering that by saying, well, you can't ban talking about race because that's our history. But he was also raising flags about whether we want to continue to organize ourselves racially because it would come with the modes of domination, right? If that's the second part of the talk, how do we think about this current moment in American democratic life? How do we think about the banning of speech no matter the topic? I've talked about the banning of speech based on race in a couple of ways, but what do we do with the society that bans talking? That says there are some things that are beyond what you should be allowed to talk about, right? Because they are so anti-American, or they're so dangerous, or they're so perilous, they're so, right, run against the grain of what we would want to do. What do we think about that as a society? So 2 things to think about when you think about this. The first is to recognize the phrase free speech is a misnomer. There's never absolutely free speech. All speech comes with normative weight. And what I mean by normative weight is it comes with moral demands. And the majority of the moral demand of speech isn't what you can't say, it's what you have to say. It's the very nature of language to precede you, to go ahead of you, and to speak for you. So any of us who speak English, we live under the normative weight of the we. When I say we, I speak for all of us. And when you say we, you speak for us all as well. That's the nature of language. There's nothing that's unconstrained about language. Language is the very basis of communal life in constraint and its entailments. So the first thing to say about free speech, right, and the banning of language is to say that there's no language that isn't in some sense already preconditioned and normatively weighted, that isn't categorical in some sense, that doesn't come with demands on you. The most basic demand on us is language, speakers of any given language, the momentum of that language goes ahead of them, and you must mean, as Stanley Cavell said, you must mean what we say when you speak. And if you speak differently than us, then we're either not going to understand you, or we're going to decide that your speech is dangerous. So the first nature of language is always to be constrained, that there is no zone of free speech as such. That any side of the political debate on this question has to begin by recognizing that speech is constrained. And if you accept that premise, then when you know you are in danger as a community is exactly the moment where you need to explicitly ban speech. So let me go back to that point, because it's a careful one, but it's a nuanced one, but it's an important one. Speech is already nuanced, is already constrained in its basic subtleties. When you speak, you have to speak and mean what we all mean when you speak and mean what you mean. That's the nature of any common language. The constraints go ahead of you. In other words, we have to agree in our speech with the preposition in. A society that succeeds and continues to go forward in time is a society that continues in its agreements. In other words, we implicitly agree with each other when we describe the country, when we describe citizenship, when we describe what civil liberties mean, what it means to be together as a democracy. The moment where you need to step out of this speech and make agreements on language, that is, decide for other people how they need to speak, the bans really aren't the problem. The bans, right, are in a sense the symptom of a much deeper problem. The ban is that we no longer have a common discourse, a common way of describing ourselves, a common way of telling the American story, a common way of imagining American society. And if some people say, well, given this divide, you ought not be able to speak this way. I'm going to ban that way of talking. Whether it be you have to talk about race or you can't talk about race. Once you have to step outside the language and make a demand on everyone else on the banning of language, in some sense, you're already in free fall. If you don't already have a common sense of we the people, and you feel the need to police some group of people, in some sense, it matters less what you decide at that point. It matters less the bans you put on the society than the fact that you need to put the bans on. Because you can no longer take it for granted that we agree in a language implicitly. Now you have to presume that people speak any kind of way they want, and you feel the need to control the speech. What that indicates is that it's very possible that you as a society no longer exist in the way that you previously thought. And that's where we're at in this country. There is, of course, a question about whether we were ever unified in our speech, but it is clearly the case that we have reached a point in American life where we can no longer take for granted that there is any kind of we in any serious or coherent way. That's when bans come into play. So what I'm saying is something like the danger of the moment really isn't just the bans, whether the ban you can't talk about race or you cannot not talk about race. The more frightening condition would be the very need to raise the bans. And that, right, that political scenario and situation can go on and on. Where the goal for any constituency within the people is no longer that we get to a place where we can mean the same thing where there is a genuine we. Rather, the primary political goal of any constituency is simply to seize power and to be the ruler and the prosecutors of the bans. And that's what I mean by the threat, the looming threat that the end has already begun. That we don't have enough we or unity left. What we have left are bans. What does Christian theology have to say about this? Well, what does Christianity have to say about this? Christian theology simply means talk about God. And we've been talking about talk. Speech about God, we've been talking about speech. The constraints and entailments of a language, and we've been talking about language. What does it mean for those of us that claim in some serious way the Eucharistic presence of Christ means something for the world? And I have to believe at a place like Holy Cross, that has to be part of the bread and butter of how you talk about anything, that you talk about things as if God matters in some serious way. And if that's you, then what does believing that what is talking about that, what is talking in those terms means for your life as an American right now? 3 things as an American Christian that terrifies me about the current moment is one is the stripping of civil liberties in American life, all the kinds of things that we're hearing about, whether people being disappeared, not only in the night any longer, but just in broad daylight. The stripping of rights for institutions, for communities, the breaking up of families and systems, the kind of terror that happens on a very basic and ordinary way on a daily basis in American life. I think I'm not the only one who feels that. The second thing that terrorizes me is how quickly the terrors of the moment teach me to think, tempt me to think this. That's happening to that family. That's happening to that college. That's what's happening in that part of the country, to that department in the university. Thank God it's not me. That the primary effect, right, is I'm going to defend myself, or I'm going to protect myself, or just hope it happens to my neighbor, but not myself. And the third thing that I find terrifying about the present moment is how much it tempts me as a person who thinks a lot about ethical commitments as us as human beings, or as us as Christians, how quickly it tempts me to think what I need to defend in this moment is the prior state of affairs, when I know that that state of affairs isn't exactly a morally good situation either. That one of the great temptations is it's going to make us defenders or apologists of systems and structures that were not particularly just to begin with. It's these three things, right? It's the terrors on a daily ordinary basis. It's how quickly it atomizes the body politic to think, well, at least I'll be taken care of. And third, how much it initiates a kind of thinking of yearning for days of old, whether it be conservative or liberal progressive days of old, when those days themselves, we should have wished for better things. And it's the constellation of these things, right, that at least I as a citizen feel drawn into thinking that I can feel the commitments to a democratic life are beginning to wane. What do we Christians have to offer? I'll answer that question by concluding with a story that William Cavanaugh tells in his book, Torture and Eucharist. Cavanaugh is a Catholic theologian who during his dissertation spent a bunch of time in Chile and investigated the disappearance of thousands of citizens during the Pinochet dictatorship. So if you don't know about the Pinochet dictatorship, in the 1970s, there were a number of socialist revolutions that led to duly elected socialist governments. Why? Because a lot of these countries in the kind of post-colonial period suffered, as you might imagine, extreme forms of poverty and inequality. And so as an attempt to gain some purchase on their own welfare and futures, they voted for folks who are socialist leaning. Well, what was the problem for them? To their north was a country that had deemed socialism and communism the scariest possible thing. And so perpetuated through what was called the Dirty Wars, the attempt to overthrow these duly elected governments. One of these places was in Pinochet's Chile. Pinochet was a military officer who rose in the ranks and then created a coup over and against the duly democratic socialist government. But that was just the beginning. Pinochet realized, insofar as the populace, the majority, had voted for this other government that he had just overturned, he would then need to quell the masses from revolting against him because there was just far more of them than there were people in his group. So Pinochet began a campaign that lasted for years of selective disappearance, that is, kidnapping of Chilean citizens, and the use of torture. And it was a very calculated mode of torture. The idea was that it wouldn't be effective if I simply disappeared you off the street and killed you and never returned you to society. Far more effective, Pinochet's regime realized, was the kidnapping you of the night, the torturing of you, and the releasing back into the citizenship. Why was that more effective? Because, of course, you would go tell your story about being tortured, and you would stand as a cautionary tale to everyone else in that community. It would silence the community. And what would happen is exactly the three things I talked about. You would be terrorized by what's happening as a citizen. You would say, thank God it's not me. And you would long for days of old that weren't particularly just themselves. And over time, this had the effect of exactly what Pinochet and his leaders desired. They atomized the population. Remember, the fundamental right of any democracy is the right to assemble. But why would you assemble if in assembling, you may assemble with two kinds of people? One, those who are working against the government that you could then be associated with, or two, governmental spies that are hiding out in your neighborhood. So what this encouraged the citizenship to do is just to no longer hang out with one another. If the baseline of democracy is the power to assemble, to come together, then what they did is they divided the body politic in a way that there could be no resistance. Where did the resistance finally come from? As Kavanaugh documents it, it largely came through a Catholic Church that first capitulated to the regime and then later on realized that God was calling them to something better. What Kavanaugh describes in the book is that these Catholic communities started to mobilize around the most basic practice of Catholic life, the Mass, and ordered their mode of politics to the sacramental order of the Catholic Church, with its high point specifically being in the Eucharist. Why? What is the Eucharist? The Eucharist is primarily two theological claims: that in the midst of a fallen world, God had given the one child, Christ, right? God had given the body of the Son to the world. And two, that around that one body gathered other bodies. In other words, it's the very heart of the idea of assembling, of gathering, of communing, of Catholicity. The coming together across significant difference around the one given body, many, many other bodies. And from these politics, Kavanaugh describes the Catholic Church in alliance with other types of groups resisting the government and finding ways through their faith towards a way forward. It was precisely their unwillingness to be atomized as a body politic, that is, as against the pressures to take care only of yourself, that we could find each other, and that would be the ground of a new democracy that could offer life to the future of Chile. What will be our modes of Eucharistic democratic gathering going forward? If, as I said, the worst thing about the bans is their most basic reality, that they mean that there is no longer a basic form of gathering in American life, what will be the sites of gathering? Will this country end in a fight for power of who controls the ban? Or will there be citizens, Americans of all stripes, who come together around the one body? And says something like, around this one body is gathered many bodies. And so therefore, emerging out of this one crucified and resurrected body is an entirely new body. That's the question before you. What life will you give to this country, right, to this democracy, and how will your life as a Catholic community make that possible? Interested in hearing what you all have to say. So we have a good amount, we have about 10, okay, time for a conversation.
So, two things to remember. I'll take the mic for people. One is that we are being recorded, in fact, and that these usually go online. So if you are speaking, remember that. It's just fair to tell you that. And I wonder if we can take some student questions or comments first.
Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for that. So when I think about the dichotomy that you presented between these two themes of bans, how do you reconcile what we see with the Trump administration, on the one hand, banning affirmative action for certain race-based selection processes, but at the same time encouraging it as a way to combat anti-Semitism?
Right, and which is important to, I think, as your question helps us remember, this is October 6th. October 7th is tomorrow, and for a lot of us, things began to feel like they're becoming undone 2 years ago tomorrow. It's not simply the question of whether there's a selective use of affirmative identification racially on issues of anti-Semitism, but also this has been a question where it seems like SCOTUS allows the identification on questions of immigration, where they don't allow identification of race on, say, questions of admissions. The irony, or probably the problem with something like that, is whether that is consistently the case, because in some sense, admissions and immigrations are both gatekeeping operations. You're asking, how can I reconcile? I don't know that I can. When I laid out the 3 drivers to the administration's ban on talking about race, I offered 3 ways of understanding it. But that's not, right, those are theories we might have for what the logic or rationale is. And those are 3 logics that are not only 3 different logics, but they're 3 different logics that could cohere, but they could also run into each other, right? There are ways in which saying something like, we're for a meritocracy. Well, if you're for a meritocracy, what you mean is we are for equal access. But the naming of systemic and structural injustice suggests that there's not real equal access. So a move to say affirmative action on admissions may be a move for meritocracy. That would be, of course, what the advocates say. But it's also the case that there's inconsistency on the center left as well on questions of affirmative action. Remember, affirmative action was initially not about questions of representation. Affirmative action was initially about questions of redistribution. They're about things like city contracts. In a city, the black sanitation company never got access to the city contracts. City contracts equal jobs and money, some form of sustainability, especially in a future where the past did not give you that opportunity. So affirmative action was, we're now going to take contracts that were systemically and historically blocked from these companies and give it to them. But what did Bakke decide? Right, Bakke's the case that decided of affirmative action in the case of the University of California. It said, we will allow affirmative action, but we are never going to allow affirmative action on the part of redistribution. Why? Because we can't imagine America going forward if that's the case. We're going to change it to questions of affirmative action on representation. And so what this meant was we weren't going to give city contracts and redistribute things like property and income, jobs. We weren't going to do that. That would be too chaotic and catastrophic for the US economy. Instead, we were going to say places like Harvard could create affirmative action selection processes that allowed certain people into the university. The idea, of course, was to make it the case that people who couldn't go to university before went to university. But of course, that's not what happened. What happened over time was it didn't change, you didn't go to university and now you're going to university. It simply changed the people already going to university where they're going to university. And it became about representation rather than redistribution. For example, many of the kids that ended up at Harvard University in the years after affirmative action was allowed were in fact people of color. But the overwhelming percentage of the people of color came already from the upper middle classes. So it really did, it was almost the opposite of redistribution. It was a kind of compromise the center left had in order to get there, to keep affirmative actions on the book. And then that's what led, right, to about 2 years ago, summer 2 years ago, the very odd position of progressive liberals like myself defending in moral seriousness the admissions policies of the most elite institutions in America, right? These are literal gatekeepers of the upper middle class and beyond. The reason we did that, and that's what I mean, there's confusion on both sides. So the question is a really good one. You're naming the places of inconsistency. You're asking, is there any consistency? I imagine so that you can get some handles on what's happening to us. But maybe the best way to put it is what we're in right now is a world where there's a language where Cavell says, Cavell's my favorite philosopher, where Cavell says something like, growing up in the modern period is like living in a world where people only sometimes more or less mean what they say, right? That the inconsistencies at this point is built in. And if a unified society is one where you have to mean what you say, that there's some consistency demanded in our common speech, then the breaking down of a society is the allowance for inconsistency to run through all of our speech. So it's not an answer. I'm trying not to dodge, but I think you put your hand on an incredibly difficult situation where inconsistency, or maybe even the value for consistency, no longer matters that much.
Professor, I'd just like to say thank you so much for coming. This has been an incredibly insightful talk. I'd like to address my question to being about certain hate speech on campus. So in the wake of the October 7th attack, certain faculty at certain different colleges around the United States were in support of it and supported violence against, these innocent people who were murdered. And, there has also been a very large amount of discrimination across college campuses. At what point in time would you say the government has to step in to intervene because colleges are tax exempt and this is our tax dollars funding this hate and this discrimination? At what point in time should we put down our foot to say this can't be tolerated?
You're asking me, like, what I think when that point should come. Well, one of the things I was trying to say is that moment is always in play, right? Insofar as we speak a common language, the normative agreements within a language come ahead of us. And what I mean is that insofar as we speak as a common community, the we is always determinative. So there's, in a sense, the government's always thinking it speaks for the people, just like the people could either consent to that claim, or object or dissent from it. So there's always this give and take about questions of consent. The best of democracy is the allowance for both, right? A democracy, a we the people acknowledge that consent of you speaking for me, that one of you in this room as an American speak for all of us, just like I speak for any of you. That's the beauty, the magic, the secret sauce of democracy. The question you're asking, is there any point where the rights of some citizens, for whatever reason, say may exigent circumstances or reduced circumstances, requires the rights of individuals within that to be silenced or to be blocked, whether it be because there's a fire in a theater or there's not a fire in the theater, right? It's a famous Supreme Court case, right? When does that come into play? I want to say that it's always in play, and God forbid it's ever in play, right? That is, it's always the case, and in some sense, the best version is when we're all in implicit agreement in a language. We all imagine the country the same. We all gather around the same narrative of what the nation is. When that is not the case, then the enforcements come into play, right? The types of banning. And so I don't know if I can answer when that should be, but it's also to say that's probably why I don't, well, maybe the best way to put it is this. The use of violence, whether it be physical violence or violences of enforcement, like the kind you're rightly raising questions about, require an epistemological clarity that I feel like I don't have. That's exactly why I feel like it's very hard to answer that question, because to say to another person in this country that you can't say that feels like, to me, presuming things that it's very hard for me to presume. Now, are we always doing that? Of course we are. So hence your good question. So that is a dodge, by the way. This wasn't a dodge, but that is a dodge. So, yes, ma'am. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Just as a quick question. So you described both the ban on talking about race, but there's also, you also spoke about the ban on not talking about race in the first place. As an Asian American myself, someone who's been in many predominantly white institutions, both in university and in high school, I've benefited from DEI offices and having those institutions try to enhance and foster that kind of dialogue. You said before this administration, for the past 20 years, we've kind of lived in a societal paradigm in which it's been taboo to not talk about race.
For the sake of the benefits that you just named.
So do you see a future post this current administration in which we can find a balance where there is, or we can find the happy medium between the two bans, or that just simply not possible because there's just no way to find any harmonious intersection between the two? Like, is there a way to balance the two, or is it just inherently that by forcing people to talk about race, we end up having one ban or another?
This question is entirely up to you all. And I'm not just being patronizing when I say this is a conversation that my generation hasn't made good on. You all are going to have to decide how you're going to hold these things together. I will say this, and I really appreciate your raising this, and maybe you felt compelled as an Asian American to raise this. But remember, the second ban, the one that said you can't not talk about race, it was two kinds of bans. One was that you can't not talk about race, and two, that you had to talk about race in a very particular way. The way this worked out for Asian Americans was particularly informative, right? Because Asian Americans, remember, are those who are discriminated against by way of racism. They're marginalized by racism, and then they're marginalized by anti-racism. Because racism, anti-racism largely thinks of racism as a black-white affair. But for all of us who grew up in America where the racism wasn't simply accepted, it was expected. And then to be told that the racism I had experienced didn't quite count. For every one of us, right, that were, and I totally was, not simply at the point of hire, but my guess at every institutional elevation in my university, that it had something to do with my race, right, that always came as a double-edged sword. Because on the one hand, the diversity got me in the door, but the diversity also narrowed substantially my life once in the room. I knew this because I knew that whenever we were talking about diversity in whatever committee, search committee, executive leadership committee, they weren't talking about me. And so I was the strange, sad soul in the room that both counted for diversity and didn't count for diversity. And then on top of that, by the way, everything I'm saying about Asian Americans, I'm guessing applies to Hispanic, Latinx communities, right? The difficulty is you are both required to talk about race, but talk about it in a very narrow way. And so Asian Americans were those who were marginalized by both racism, anti-racism, and then the next move was what they couldn't do is ever talk about it. Why? Because to talk about it seemed to undermine the ban in the first place. And that put Asian Americans in a very precarious position, right? And that's why, 4 or 5 years ago, COVID unleashes this massive torrent of thousands of acts of violence, often quite physical, often quite brutal, against Asian Americans. Black Lives Matters 2 begins, right, at that time. And it's as if those exist as two parallel realities in America. Whereas we want to think that there's some deep entwinement between the two. So for every way that diversity benefits, it works against it. It's the nature of bans, right, in a sense, to come with both sides of the sword.
Hi, this is kind of similar to Jaden's question, but you mentioned that in terms of race speech, it's effectively banned because we're policing ourselves, which I thought was very interesting. So what do you think that we can be doing to be fostering environments where people don't feel the need to police themselves hypothetically when talking about race speech?
Yeah, it's a great question. Sue Garrick teaches at Harvard Law School, so I'm sure there's a number of pre-law folks in this room. As those who are headed to law school know that the primary way you teach law is the Socratic method, right? There's a give and take in the classroom. And in order for it to work, every student has to be able to venture what she thinks on some issue. It doesn't mean she knows she's right, but if there is not even the attempt, the shared sense of responsibility, the shared sense of vulnerability in venturing your thought, then you can't do the Socratic method, i.e. you can't teach law. Sue Garrick, in a piece in the New York Times right around COVID, wrote that she had been teaching at Harvard Law for some time, and she says, post-2014, what happens around 2014? Advent of social media in America, right? After social media, she noticed the Socratic method no longer works in a Harvard Law School class. Why? Everyone is scared to death about being canceled. Remember, in the law school, we're not asking you, what is your personal opinion on this issue, race, abortion, immigration? You're saying, well, what did the case say, and do you have some handle on the case details? So you're not risking a personal opinion, but even that felt too threatening in the classroom. Why? Because you never wanted to come off as a racist. You never wanted to come off as homophobic. You never wanted to come off as anti-religious. And so when I said the greatest forms of bans during this time was probably less the ban to do or to not to do, but was rather by way of the government or by way of the institution, it was our own self-policing, the constant sense that if I say the wrong thing, I'm going to get in trouble. That's not simply the end, right? That's not simply the end of the Socratic method in law schools. That's the end of democratic life. Democratic life is the staking of yourself for the good of the community. If we're not willing to do that, then think about my second temptation. My primary response to a struggling democracy is, thank God it's not me. So that's why, in answer to this question, it's got to come back to you all. You all have to decide, what kind of country do we want? And my hope is that your Christianity will deeply inform that, right? In some ways, in the same way that what we're learning by way of the massive scaling back of federal grants to universities makes a mockery of the very idea of private education. Right, that we had anything but a private educational system. It was always public. It was just improperly public. Right? In the same way that's the case, right, we need to imagine democracy in a new frontier. In the same way that maybe one of the benefits to the pressures of higher ed is that higher ed will think of itself differently, genuinely obligated to publics, not just an elite institution for elites. You all, your generation, like the people in this room, will need to lean in and figure out a way to say to each other, the one thing we're not going to do in this classroom is police each other, where the effect of our common speech is you say the wrong thing, you're canceled. That is the end of a common life. And unless you all decide to do that, right? And the problem for y'all is that we're just beginning to get our head around social media, like what it's doing to our brains, what it's doing to our communities, just like we're just beginning to figure out what COVID has meant for our common social life. The problem is we're having to make these decisions in real time, and the go-to mode is a kind of fear. Like the one thing I've noticed about this generation of students, like you get to a place like Holy Cross, you get to a place like Duke, and you think to yourself, I've made it, the whole world is open to me now. Right? I can go save the planet, I can go pursue my dreams. What's amazing to me is in the last 50 years, how quickly that switched to the primary thing you're thinking about is how do I not fail? And if that's the case, then in some sense, we've already surrendered our futures. When I teach race at Duke, what I always say to the students from the beginning is, expect two things in this classroom. I'm gonna fail in talking about race. I'm gonna offend someone, I'm gonna misrepresent someone, I'm not gonna properly pay attention to the hurts and wounds you bring into this classroom. And expect that you'll do the same thing. If we could at least begin there, that we're not all, in a sense, canonized saints, but we're rather human beings with histories who might have some benefits to offer to the future, if we can begin there, that's why, remember, the Eucharist begins with not I'm awesome, I'm never going to make a mistake. The Eucharist begins with I'm needy. I need Christ. If I don't eat this stuff, I don't live. That's got to be the beginning of a politics. If you all can lay claim to that and imagine a common citizenship around that, then the questions of polarization and the questions of kind of finding a common people actually stands a chance. I don't know which way it goes at this point, but in some sense, I think in answer to your questions, at this point, I don't know that it's up to me. Or maybe the best way of saying, to speak for my generation, is that we had our chance. And this is where we're at. This is now your inheritance.
We have to stop, and that seems
Okay.
like a great place to stop. So
Okay.
thank you very much.
Thank you to the center for having me. Thanks to Professor Liu. I know there were several hands that we didn't get to. I'm happy to stick around to talk further. So, thank you.